cheap labor destroying nations. Here in South Africa, apartheid kind of sowed the seeds of its own destruction by having a fixation, a addiction. And when apartheid, are you saying apartheid was had feelings? No, I mean white people, the white institutional leadership of the country had a fixation and addiction to cheap labor. Cheap labor is never of your own people group. So when I say cheap labor destroys nations, it destroys two nations: the nation that engages it and the nation that supplies it. So in South Africa's context, the cheap labor was black migrant labor. They would live in their homelands. They would have their own sovereign areas, if you want to call it that. But they would go and find work in the white cities. So they would be migrant labor, and they would send money back. So the way it destroyed their nationhood, their economies, is they never built economies. They went and worked elsewhere. It's the same for Latin America. Latin America sends migrant laborers up into the USA. And so their economies suffer, their families suffer, it destroys their nation. Now, how does it destroy those who engage in it? You look at every nation. Rome and Greece had cheap slave labor. Britain had slave labor, and then obviously engaged in the colonial cheap labors. America, South Africa, Rhodesia. What introducing cheap labor is it's always a foreign group. So in a homogenous society, cheap labor is for the young, the teenagers. Teenagers conduct cheap labor where they learn skills, they grow a network, and they graduate out of it into either becoming business owners or more skillful employees. That is what happens in a homogenous society. Now, in a cheap labor, migrant labor society, the teenagers are pushed out of that cheap work for migrant laborers. One of Ben Franklin's little pamphlets that he wrote on the peopling of nations. But he said the main problem of why slavery was adopted was transience, especially in resource-rich, space-rich colonies. South Africa, lots of space. America, lots of space. The Roman Empire expanding, lots of space. So what would happen, the citizens, you would work for someone, and then you'd be like, great, I've got the skills, or I've got a little bit of capital, I'm going to go and get my own land. I'm going to go and start on my own because there's so much spatial resource. And so all the business owners end up adopting slavery. Not all, but a lot of the business owners end up adopting slavery if they want consistent labor because of the transient nature of the colonial spatial resources. It's also one of the problems why people don't like teenage labor or young homogenous labor is because every year it's different. Every year you have to train a new teenager. And so there's this kind of addiction to foreign labor. Then even you look at it from the capitalistic kind of oligarchical perspective. When you look at unrestrained migrant immigration, migrant labor immigration, who benefits from that? Obviously, the business owners who are using cheap labor. Obviously, real estate prices, right? So if you are bringing millions of people in, real estate becomes a huge part. The real estate market becomes far more saturated, right? So while, all this migrant labor, it halves the labor market and drives prices down, it doubles it doubles the labor market, halves the price. And then it doubles the real estate market, doubles the price. It destroys the nation because now young families that want to get their own house now have all of these high property prices. So that's another whole aspect of this. So we've addressed how it destroys their own nation because they aren't developing their own economy, how it destroys our nation through edging out the young and the poor, so there's another point. So in a homogenous nation, you will have your own poor, right? You'll have your own poor classes. They need work, and so if you're importing another nation's poor class to compete with them, so you're competing for the poor are competing, you're competing with teenagers, you're competing for the residential market. Another issue that cheap labor provides is that because it'll never be of your own people, right? People feel bad having cheap labor of their own people. That's why you edge out your own poor you'd rather hire a poor Mexican or a poor black than a poor white because, I don't feel good about paying him that price. Exactly. He's your own people. You should be looking after him, and so you don't feel bad about stiffing other ethnicities. You don't feel bad about poor working conditions or poor pay, etc., for other nations. And what this does is it introduces racial strife, ethnic strife, or grievances. Right now, often a lot of the first generation migrant laborers are just super pumped for the opportunity. They're super grateful to work for very low wages. But their children who grow up, number one, they grow up not as native, not as the host nation, right? They are different. So there is no integration. So that's one form of grievance. The second form of grievance is, their parents are still treated as, migrant labor. So it just introduces a crazy ethnic strife into the economic zone, which is a problem. And so when you look at any nationalist economic platform, you want labor protectionism. Now, it's a really interesting, not many people have ever read the Austrian artist's coffee table book, but it's a fascinating study. Like for the huge, big conflagration in history that it is, the fact that we don't read it as a primary source is mind-baffling. Anyway, in the artist's coffee table book, he talks about the original use of the labor unions. The labor unions were not Marxist in their creation. The labor unions were an attempt to address the capital, the oligarchical class's abuse of the underclass, the poor labor. They didn't have Marxist Leninist tactics of class and racial warfare. They just wanted to say, like, hey, we're here working for you, industrialist. We don't want to die of poverty and sickness and disease and accidents and all that kind of stuff. The problem was, now he's talking about Austria in 1906, 1907 onwards. He said the problem was that the conservatives didn't take the unions seriously. They were like, we don't need to pander to the unions. We don't need to, the dirty poors, we don't need to do anything for them. And so, of course, the Marxists came along and said, we'll pander to you. And so since like 1911, all unions around the world have basically been synonymous with Marxism because the Marxists were the only ones who paid attention to the dirty poors. And so this brings, the question back to Christian nationalism for us, or just the nationalist, for anyone who's a serious nationalist of like, there are nationalist solutions to our current clown world problems. One of those solutions has to be caring for our own poor. You can't just be, a middle class bougie nationalist who's like, oh, your nationalism and all this stuff. And then you look at your underclass and be like, let's outsource them or get rid of them or, ignore them, whatever. It's like, no, all nationalist thought has to have the undertaking of driving your own poor out of poverty and out of violence and out of degeneracy. And so unfortunately, when you look at anything that kind of touches on that, people get very antsy because, they've been so memed into unions are Marxist. Looking after the poor is socialist. Punishing oligarchs is communist. And it's like, no, like we've all got very nationalistic reasons and motivations to do those things. Any serious nationalist you don't have to like your poor, but you have to realize that they are your poor. And so you have to deal with them benevolently. You want your own poor to be driven out of poverty. And so one of the huge things there is you don't want to be importing labor to compete with them. You don't want to be importing another underclass to compete with them for labor. You don't want to import another underclass to compete with them for housing. You don't want to import another labor class to compete with them for space, for law and order space, because you start getting these enclaves that, law and order is a huge need for the underclass. It's a very violent life. And it's hard for us, it's hard for us to compete until your institutions actually make laws for your people. Because until you kick out foreign cheap labor, your guys can't compete with the price points. So, gentlemen, I hope you're all having a great weekend. keeping your head above all of the war madness. It's funny how I think there's like a huge bloodlust in all of our society. Our Western societies are atomized, or what is the word I'm looking for? Divided. That there's a huge bloodlust that is being fulfilled vicariously through other people's wars. You have all these liberals taking the side of Ukraine because they all think that they are the heroic, whatever. But it's like it's their own vicarious wish to destroy and kill the strong patriarchal types. Then all of the right wing guys are like, oh sweet, like just a war between empires is what we see it. It's kind of like it's really akin to the Taliban kind of thing at the end of when was Taliban? End of last year. Anyway, where we were all like celebrating for them, like good on them, like good on them. And then everyone's like, oh, you're celebrating the Pashtis, you are Taliban. So, but it's like, no, like I don't, like, don't you know the Taliban are evil and they do all these crazy things? And it's like, no, chaps, look, I'm not saying I bought a Tali flag and now I say the prayers 5 times a day. I don't. But you can see what is good for certain people. Does it serve our interests? And right now, our interests, as nationalists, are not being served by the GAE. In fact, the GAE is subjugating our nationalist groups. They are acting against the interests of our nationalist groups. So when the GAE takes a knock and starts to lose its power and to be weakened, you can say this is a wonderful thing for us. This is a good thing for us. And then people are like, oh, you hate America. And it's like, no, like actually, if you loved America, you would realize that the GAE is a cosmopolitan empire that is not America. Like Americans are not in control of the GAE. It's like anyone can be an American. And it's like, and there's your problem. You have no respect. A lot of people have no respect for the original host American nation. It was the same way for the global Anglo Empire, GAE 1.0. Everyone in power were not Anglo, loved their Anglo people. And it's like, no, you had financiers and bankers and foreign aristocrats and foreign bankers. And, it's like using the Anglos as pawns in their global resource extraction game. And now kind of turning all of the institutions against the Anglos and the Anglo nations and bringing the world in to pit them against them. The American people is not the same thing as the American empire. The Anglo people are not the same thing as the Anglo Empire. And so when you see the empire taking a knock, you can celebrate that perhaps your nation stands a chance of sovereignty someday soon, hopefully in our lifetimes. So it's all been a very interesting propaganda fest. And also just like the amount of bloodlust of all of these people, they all want war and they want death. And it's like, wait a minute, like, just a couple weeks ago, weren't you saying if it just saves one life, wear a mask? Now it's like, go die on some foreign field. They are insufferable. Who dares wins? We have too many parasites talking in our name, giving our people a bad image across the world. That's exactly it, man. That's exactly it. Talking in our name. Us not identifying as whatever our empire is anymore, but by our people. And I think that's where we struggle. Americans struggle, Anglos struggle. Is that we don't have another name. The Afrikaners have another name from, they're not Dutch or French or German anymore. They are now Afrikaners. The Amish, right? The Amish are not German or Swiss or Dutch or whatever they were. They're now Amish. The Mormons are now Mormon. And it's a thing we struggle with, because heritage Americans, quite rightly, still want sovereignty over America. They still... It was there. You asked this question, like, do you give up the American name, the American flag, to try and preserve some form of cultural sovereignty? It's where we're at with the Anglos. I've been reading this book written in 1940 called There Are No South Africans. And he's basically talking about the whole contextual history between the English South Africans and the Afrikaans South Africans and how neither formed just one united vision for South Africa, but there's like the British vision and there's the Afrikaans vision. And, for the British to cut themselves off from England and become African Anglos, there needed to be an adoption of self-reliance and being almost cut off. It's what happened with the Rhodesians. It's why the Rhodesians had an identity, because the Rhodesians were cut off by England. So they were like, this is it, chaps, we fight on our own, like the Afrikaners, right? So the Rhodesians were the closest thing that Anglos have achieved to a sovereign culture away from their empire. The Americans are kind of in that space now, but they're still in America with the American institutions. At least Rhodesians were, however many thousand miles away from London. But it's the same thing where this hostile empire is hostile to your interests, your local interests. And so you declare independence, you declare sovereignty over your culture and your economy, your institutions, your people, and you call yourself by a different name. So the Rhodesians were, because that's the next thing. It's like, I don't want to throw away my Anglo heritage. I love my Anglo heritage. I love my Anglo language. I love my Anglo customs and manner. I'm not throwing all of that away to spite, some grievance or whatever. It's like, no. I'm very much Anglo, but there has to be a different flag to unite under. There has to be a different group name, if you want to call it that, to unite under. And the Rhodesians achieved that. The Americans achieved that in their first revolution, right? They stopped being English colonists and they became American. Now, unfortunately, they need to separate from the American empire, and it's the same. It's the same with us Anglos across the Anglosphere: Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa. Even Anglos in England. It's an identity issue. A name is the public side of the identity. If you don't have a name, people don't know what to call you. And then they start calling you that. The Nazis didn't call themselves Nazis. They were called Nazis by the media. And then it stuck. And that's okay. It's okay if people give you a pejorative that you just ride with and go with it. So these are the kind of things we're grappling through on our way to a idea of cultural sovereignty. Because cultural sovereignty will arrive before political power, political sovereignty. So you look at the Amish, they have cultural sovereignty, but not political sovereignty. You look at the Afrikaners today, they have cultural sovereignty, but not political sovereignty. So what I mean by cultural sovereignty is you have control of your cultural institutions, church, media, academia. Your children are going to be more Amish in the next generation than you were. Whereas for us, we have no cultural sovereignty. That means the church, the media, and the academia are all controlled by our enemies, by those who are our empire, the empire that subjugates us, which means our children will be more like the empire. And that's our main issue right now is, political sovereignty can only come once the empire crumbles. I think the Amish know that. There is no chance of political sovereignty for the Amish or the Mormons. There's no, and this is where I'm at with the whole Ukraine situation. There is no chance of political sovereignty for the Ukrainians either way. They're a vassal of the GAE or they're a vassal of the Russians. There is no other way for them. So it's like, chap, pick the lesser of two evils. Don't be stupid trying to kill all your people on some, suicide glory pact. It's like, you're a vassal state. You are a vassal state. You are a conquered vassal state. Lie down and stop destroying your people. Stop destroying your infrastructure. Just transfer the vassal to the next empire. And that's the way it is for the American population, the host founding stock American nation. Until the GAE crumbles, I say we because I've married into it, but we will remain subjugated because the power issue, there is no, right now, and praise God if I'm wrong, but right now there is no power struggle that we would be able to win. So it's a cultural struggle. And without the cultural sovereignty, it's useless going to the capital. It's useless having a civil war if you don't have cultural sovereignty. Because let's say our guys win, the Donald gets elected in 2016. We win power. We have power sovereignty. Oh my gosh, our guy. We have no cultural sovereignty. The church, the media, the academia are all so owned by the deep state, by the cabal, by the financiers, whoever, whatever liberal kind of tag you want to put on them, that it doesn't matter if your guy's in power because culturally you're just everyone says that culture follows power. And it's like, it's a both and, it's a chicken and egg vibe, Where I'm just so super encouraged is this is where we've got to focus is cultural dominion, sovereignty over your family institutions, sovereignty over your local economy, sovereignty over your church, over your media that you consume and create, over your academia that you send your children to or that you create for your children. We have to have cultural sovereignty. The Amish and the Mormons are in a better place to wield power than heritage Americans or Anglos are, because they have cultural systems, cultural sovereignty systems, which allow them to wield power for their interests, not for everyone else. Oh, the Donald gets in power. Well, let's help the gays. Let's help the blacks. Let's help the foreigners. Let's help Mexico. Let's help Israel. Let's help China. Let's help everybody but the host nation, the host heritage founding stock. It's because we have no cultural sovereignty to demand that. God bless you, boys.